The alarm on Dr. Ha-Yun's wrist buzzed twice, sharp and sudden, pulling her from the data stream that had captured her attention for the last 4 hours. She was sitting at her desk in the research quarters, surrounded by screens showing atmospheric readings from the monitoring stations outside. The morning had started like any other day on Kepler 442b, but something was different today. The numbers didn't match. They didn't make sense. Ha-Eun was 34 years old and had spent the last 5 years studying alien ecosystems. She had volunteered for the Kepler 442b mission because she believed that understanding new forms of life was the most important work a scientist could do. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple knot, and her brown eyes were tired from staring at screens, but her mind was alive with questions. The readings showed unusual activity near the crystalline forest, about 15 kilometers from the main settlement. The forest was where they had first made contact with the native species 3 months ago. The creatures, which the team called Velkari, were large and impressive. They had scales that looked like metal, eyes that seemed almost intelligent, and a way of moving that suggested they understood more than just basic animal behavior. But no one fully understood them yet. Not really. Ha-Yun stood up quickly, her chair rolling backward. She needed to get to the monitoring station. She needed to see what was happening out there. The readings suggested something was changing in the Velkari's behavior, and if Ha-Yun was right, it could mean they were learning to trust humans, or it could mean something far more dangerous was happening. She moved through her small quarters, grabbing her equipment belt and her digital notebook. The station was small. Only 23 people lived here, and most of them were specialists in different fields. Ha-Yun was the lead xenobiologist, which meant she was the one who understood the creatures better than anyone. It also meant that when strange things happened, she was the one who had to investigate. As she rushed toward the main corridor, she passed the common area where people usually kept their meal rations. The small refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. Ha-Eun had prepared her lunch that morning, a simple meal of protein bars, dried fruit, and a drink that tasted like old water but gave her energy. It was sitting in that refrigerator, waiting for her. But she didn't think about it. Her mind was too full of numbers and questions. The director, a stern man named Kim Sung-jae, stopped her in the corridor just as she was heading toward the exit. His gray hair and serious face made him look like he carried the weight of the entire human colony on his shoulders. "Dr. Ha-Eun, where are you going so fast?" he asked, stepping into her path with one hand raised. "The monitoring station near the crystalline forest," Ha-Eun said quickly. "The atmospheric readings have changed. Something unusual is happening with the Velkari population. I need to see what it is." Director Kim frowned. "You should take a security team with you. We still don't know enough about those creatures to go out alone." "I'll be fine," Ha-Yun said, already moving past him. "I've been studying them for months. They're not hostile, not yet anyway." She didn't wait for his response. She knew he would worry, but she also knew that she was the best person to investigate this. As she pushed through the outer airlock and stepped into the thin Kepler 442b atmosphere, she breathed in air that was nothing like Earth's. It was thin and slightly sweet, and it made her feel alive in a way that the recycled air inside the station never could. The walk to the monitoring station took an hour. The landscape around the colony was beautiful in a strange way. The ground was covered with crystalline structures that caught the light of the local sun and threw it back in 1,000 different directions. The trees, if they could even be called that, were tall and angular, looking like they were made from glass. Nothing on this planet looked quite like anything from Earth, and that was exactly why Ha-Eun loved it. The monitoring station was a small building, no bigger than a storage shed, sitting on a raised platform overlooking the crystalline forest. Ha-Eun had designed it herself, and it held the instruments that tracked weather patterns, seismic activity, and the movement of large creatures like the Velkari. She unlocked it and stepped inside, letting the door seal behind her. The screens inside the building came to life as she entered, showing her all the data she could want. But now, looking at the information in real time, Ha-Un understood what the readings meant. The Velkari were gathering, not in a way that suggested danger or attack, but in a way that suggested something else, something purposeful. Something that required many of them to come together in the same place. Ha-Yun started taking notes, checking equipment, and gathering more detailed information. The hours passed. She forgot about time. She forgot about the sun's position in the sky. She forgot about her stomach, which had been making quiet complaints for the last hour. Most importantly, she forgot about her lunch, still sitting in the refrigerator back at the main station, waiting for her to return. By the time Ha-Un looked up from her work, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the horizon. The light through the windows of the monitoring station had turned orange and red, beautiful and dangerous. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up. Ha-Yun's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The toxic winds were coming. On Kepler 442b, as the sun set, the temperature dropped quickly. The atmosphere became unstable. Heavy winds picked up, carrying gases that were toxic to human lungs even through the protective suit Ha-Un wore. The winds usually lasted 4 to 6 hours, and they usually came at night. And Ha-Un was too far from the main station to make it back safely before they arrived. She looked at her emergency supplies. There was water and a small amount of food in the station, but not much. She had her communication device, but the winds would make transmission difficult. She was alone, 15 kilometers away from help, and the most dangerous part of the day was about to begin. Ha-Yun sat down heavily in her chair and took a deep breath. She had trained for emergencies. She knew how to survive. She would lock down the station, seal it properly, and wait until the winds passed. It would be uncomfortable, but she would be safe. What she didn't know, as she began to prepare the monitoring station for the long night ahead, was that she was not as alone as she believed. In the crystalline forest, just beyond the edge of the monitoring station, 3 young creatures were watching her. They had been watching for a long time, and they had noticed something very important. The human was weak. The human was far from her group. And the human, without knowing it, was about to need help. The 3 young Velkari moved through the crystalline forest with the kind of grace that only came from a lifetime of knowing every path, every sharp edge, and every dangerous turn. Daewon led the way, his body smaller and leaner than the massive adults of his kind, but his eyes sharp and intelligent. Behind him, Mira and Taio followed, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested they had hunted together for many seasons. Daewon was the oldest of the 3, and even though he was still young compared to the adult Velkari, he had already begun to show the kind of leadership that his kind respected. His scales caught the fading light of the sun, throwing off reflections of blue and green. Mira, the smallest of the group, moved with a kind of nervous energy. She was clever and observant, but she was also cautious. Teo was somewhere between his 2 companions, strong enough to be useful in a hunt, but not so confident that he didn't defer to Daewon's judgment. The 3 of them had been watching the human settlement for many weeks. At first, they had watched because they were curious. The creatures that lived in the settlement were different from anything else on Kepler 442b. They were soft and small, with only 2 strong limbs instead of 4. They made strange sounds and built even stranger structures. But over time, the 3 cubs had begun to understand that these humans were not just different. They were also intelligent. Daewon had observed the female human, the one who went to the monitoring station almost every day. She was smaller than most of her group, and she seemed to be more interested in watching and learning than in hunting. The cubs had learned that this was what her kind did. They gathered information. They tried to understand. It was not so different from what the Velkari did, except that the humans were much slower and much weaker. The female human had gone to the monitoring station that morning. The cubs had watched her leave the main settlement. They had followed her, staying far enough back that she would not notice them. The cubs were curious about what she was doing, about what data she was gathering. They were learning the patterns of human behavior, and this female was interesting because she seemed to have her own patterns, her own way of doing things. When the sun began to sink and the temperature started to drop, the three cubs understood what was coming. The toxic winds would arrive soon. The winds were dangerous for creatures with the Valkyries kind of lungs, but they were deadly for humans. The cubs had watched the humans carefully lock up their settlement before the winds came. They had never seen humans go out into the winds, but the female was still in the monitoring station. Daewon stopped moving through the forest and turned to look at his companions. Mira was already looking at him with her large eyes, and Teo had pressed his body low to the ground in a posture of attention. Even without speaking, they understood each other. This was what pack bonds meant among the Valkyrie. It meant knowing what your companions were thinking before they had to tell you. The monitoring station was visible through the crystalline trees, perched on its raised platform like a strange creation that did not belong on this world. The female was inside, visible through the transparent sections of the building. She was moving slowly now, checking instruments, securing things. She seemed to understand that the winds were coming, but she was not leaving. She was staying in the station. Daewon's instincts told him to approach the settlement, to make himself visible. But he also understood that this was different from any contact the cubs had made before. The other humans had always been at the settlement, surrounded by their group. This female was alone. She was weak, or at least appeared to be weak compared to the adult humans. And she was trapped. In Valkyrie culture, certain rules governed behavior. One of the most important rules was about honor and about the treatment of the vulnerable. If an adult human had walked into this situation, Daewon might have stayed away. But a single human, alone and possibly in danger? That was different. That created an obligation. Mira moved closer to Daewon and made a low sound in her throat, a kind of questioning rumble. She was asking if they were going to approach. Daewon considered this carefully. The wind was already beginning to pick up, carrying with it the scent of the toxic gases that would soon fill the air. They did not have much time to make a decision. He made his choice. Daewon moved forward, stepping out of the crystalline forest and into the open area around the monitoring station. The movement was slow and deliberate, not the quick dash of a predator attempting to catch prey. Behind him, Mira and Teo followed, spreading out slightly to either side in a non-threatening formation. They were making themselves visible to the human, but they were also showing, through their body language and movement, that they meant no harm. Inside the monitoring station, Ha-Un looked up from her work just as the three figures emerged from the forest. For a moment, she froze. Her hand stopped moving, her breath caught in her throat. She was looking at three juvenile Valkyrie, standing in clear view of the monitoring station, watching her with their large, intelligent eyes. Every protocol in her training told her to seal the doors more carefully, to activate the emergency systems, to call the settlement for backup. But something else, something deeper than training, told her something different. The creatures were not attacking. They were not even approaching the station directly. They were simply standing there, watching her, as if they wanted her to see them. Ha-Un slowly stood up from her chair. She moved to the window and looked down at the three creatures. The largest one, the blue-green, scaled one that seemed to be the leader, was looking directly at her. And in that moment, Ha-Un understood something that no scientist at the settlement had yet grasped. The Valkyrie were not just intelligent. They were capable of making choices, moral choices. And this one, standing in the gathering darkness with the toxic winds beginning to blow, had chosen to make his presence known to her. The question was why, and more importantly, What did he intend to do next? The wind was getting stronger now. Soon it would be too dangerous, even for the Velkari to be outside. Ha-un watched as the leader made a sound, a kind of call that echoed across the distance between them. The other two creatures responded with similar sounds, and then, to Ha-un's surprise, they began to move toward the monitoring station. She realized in that moment that whatever was about to happen, it would change everything. The carefully controlled relationship between humans and Velkari was about to transform into something new, something that no one at the settlement had planned for or prepared for. And it was starting because one scientist had forgotten her lunch, and three curious creatures had decided to offer help to someone in need. Ha-un's first instinct was fear, a basic human response that made her step back from the window. Her hand moved toward the emergency button that would lock down the station completely, sealing her inside and the creatures outside. But something stopped her. The movements of the Velkari were careful and measured. They were not moving with the quick, aggressive speed of hunters attacking prey. They were moving slowly, almost respectfully, as if they understood that sudden movements might frighten her. The leader, the one Ha-un found herself watching most carefully, stopped about 10 meters from the monitoring station. The wind was picking up strength now, and the sky had turned a deep orange color. Soon it would be dark, and the toxic gases would make the atmosphere unbreathable for a human without protection. The Velkari, with their different physiology, would be in danger too, but not as much danger as Ha-un would face. Through the window, Ha-un could see that the largest Velkari, the one who seemed to be in charge, was making movements with his front limbs. He was pointing, gesturing toward something. Ha-un followed the direction of his movement with her eyes and saw what he was trying to show her. On the ground, about halfway between the Velkari and the monitoring station, there were several crystalline growths. They were the kind of plants that grew naturally on Kepler 442b, and Ha-un had studied them before. The Velkari ate them regularly. She had watched them do it during her observation sessions. But the creatures were not there to eat these plants. They were there to present them. Ha-un realized what was happening, and the realization made her hands tremble slightly. The Velkari were offering her food. They had brought food to the monitoring station to give to her because they understood that she was trapped, she was hungry, and she needed help. It was an act of kindness that transcended species. It was an offer of hospitality made in the way that Velkari understood hospitality. And it was, Ha-un understood from her studies of their behavior, a significant gesture. It meant something. She took a deep breath and made a decision. Instead of sealing the station, she opened the side hatch, the one designed for emergency access. The wind rushed in immediately, bringing with it the acrid smell of the toxic atmosphere. It was not yet strong enough to kill her through her protective suit, but it soon would be. She stepped outside into the wind, her suit's systems working hard to filter the air she breathed. The three Velkari tensed as she emerged, but they did not attack. They did not move toward her aggressively. Instead, Day One, the leader, made another sound, a kind of rumbling call that sounded almost like approval. Ha-un walked slowly toward the crystalline growths. The wind was pulling at her suit, making it difficult to move steadily, but she managed to reach the plants. She picked one up carefully, examining it. The surface was smooth and cold, and it smelled faintly sweet. According to the research she had done, it would be safe for her to eat. It would provide nutrients and energy. She brought the crystal plant to her mouth and bit into it. The taste was strange, nothing like anything from Earth, but it was not unpleasant. It was slightly sweet, and it gave her a sense of fullness almost immediately. Her stomach, which had been complaining for hours, seemed to settle with the first few bites. Mira, the smallest of the three Velkari, made a sound that seemed almost like excitement. Teo moved slightly closer, though still not approaching too quickly. But Day One remained where he was, watching Ha-un with those intelligent eyes, as if he was assessing her, understanding her, accepting her into something larger than mere survival. Ha-un finished the first crystal plant and picked up another. The wind was getting stronger, and she knew she did not have much time. The toxic atmosphere was becoming denser, more dangerous. But before she could move back toward the monitoring station, something unexpected happened. The three Velkari began to move. But they did not move away from her. Instead, they positioned themselves around her, creating a kind of barrier between her and the worst of the wind. Daewon placed himself on one side, Mira on another, and Teo behind her. Their large bodies, with their heavy scales and powerful forms, blocked some of the force of the toxic wind. Ha-un understood immediately what they were doing. They were protecting her. They were using their own bodies as shields to keep the dangerous atmosphere away from her while she continued to eat. It was an act of remarkable compassion, and it carried with it a weight of meaning that Ha-un understood even without being told. The Velkari were claiming her as part of their responsibility. In Velkari culture, when one creature accepted the protection of another, it created a bond, an obligation, a debt that would need to be repaid through loyalty and mutual respect. By accepting the cub's protection, Ha-un was entering into something much larger than she had realized. But there was no choice to refuse. The wind was now strong enough that breathing was becoming difficult even with her suit's help. The cub's protection was the only thing keeping her from being blown backward or overcome by the toxic gases. So Ha-un continued to eat the crystal plants, consuming them quickly, drawing strength and energy from the food that the young Velkari had brought to her. As she ate, she found herself studying the cubs more carefully. The way Mira kept glancing at her, as if checking to make sure she was still all right. The way Teo's muscles were tense, ready to respond to any change in the wind or atmosphere. And the way Daewon never took his eyes off her, never relaxed his stance, never wavered in his commitment to keeping her safe. The wind howled around them, growing stronger and more violent. The sun was now completely hidden behind the horizon. The sky had turned to twilight, and soon it would be full darkness. But three young creatures and one human scientist stood together in the growing storm, connected by an act of food sharing and mutual need. Ha-un finished the last of the crystal plants and straightened up. She looked at Daewon, met his gaze directly. And in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition that they were not so different after all. That courage and compassion existed in creatures from different worlds, different species, different kinds of bodies. That taking care of someone weaker than yourself was not weakness, but strength. The next part of the night would be the hardest part. The part where they would need to find shelter. The part where the true strength of this unexpected bond would be tested. But for now, in this moment, Ha-un knew that she was not alone. And the three Velkari cubs, standing around her in the toxic wind, had made a choice that would change all of them forever. The night was deeper and darker than Ha-un had ever experienced on Kepler 442b. The toxic winds had reached their peak intensity, making it impossible for her to return to the monitoring station. The building was sealed and safe, but it was too far away to reach through the dangerous atmosphere. The only shelter available was the cave that Daewon led them to, a natural formation in the crystalline forest where the Velkari had stayed before. The cave was not warm, but it was protected from the worst of the wind and gases. The entrance was narrow enough that the cubs could block most of the toxic air from entering. Inside, the darkness was almost complete, broken only by the faint bioluminescence of certain plants that grew on the cave walls. The light was pale blue and green, making the cave feel like they had stepped into another world entirely. Ha-un was exhausted. The combination of hunger, stress, and the physical exertion of moving through the dangerous winds had taken everything out of her. Her suit's battery was at 70%. which should be enough to last through the night. But she was conserving power by keeping only the most essential systems active. The air filtration was working, but barely. The heating was minimal. She was cold and tired and scared, though she tried not to show it to the three creatures who had taken responsibility for keeping her alive. Day Wan positioned himself at the cave entrance, his large body blocking much of the opening. The wind outside continued to howl and rage, making sounds that were almost like screaming. Through the narrow opening, Ha-Un could see the darkness and feel the occasional strong gust that penetrated even Day Wan's protective form. Mira moved deeper into the cave and lay down on the cold stone, her body curved in a way that seemed almost welcoming. She looked at Ha-Un with what seemed like an invitation, and Ha-Un understood. The cubs were suggesting that she lie down near them, that she use their body heat to stay warm through the night. It was an unusual thing for a human to do, to lie down beside a large alien creature, trusting completely that she would not be harmed. But Ha-Un had passed the point of caution hours ago. She had accepted the cubs' help. She had allowed them to protect her. At this point, using their warmth for survival was just the next logical step. She moved carefully across the cave floor and lay down next to Mira. The smaller Velkari's body was warm, almost hot, compared to the cold stone floor. Mira made a soft sound, something that might have been approval, and shifted slightly, positioning herself to maximize the transfer of heat to the human who lay beside her. Teo moved to Ha-Yun's other side, lying down in a way that created a kind of protective cocoon around her. With both cubs positioned to either side and Daewon blocking the entrance, Ha-Un found herself completely surrounded by the creatures that were keeping her alive. It should have felt dangerous. It should have felt like she was trapped with predators. Instead, it felt safe. The hours passed slowly. Ha-Yun drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind too tired to remain fully awake, but her body too stressed to sleep deeply. She was aware of the wind outside, aware of the movement of the creatures around her, aware of her own breathing and heartbeat and the sound of the storm raging beyond the cave. Sometimes, Mira would shift against her, checking that she was still breathing. Sometimes Teo would turn his head to look at her, making sure she was still alive. And Daewon, at the entrance, never rested. He stayed alert and watchful throughout the entire night, his eyes open and aware, his muscles ready to respond to any change in the conditions outside or any threat that might emerge from somewhere unexpected. Around the middle of the night, Ha-Yun's fever began to rise. The stress and hunger of the day had weakened her immune system, and her body was fighting an infection. She began to shake with chills, and her skin felt hot despite the cold cave air. Mira seemed to understand immediately that something was wrong. She made a series of sounds, not alarming ones, but concerned ones, and pressed herself more firmly against Ha-Un's side. Tayo responded to Mira's sounds by checking on Ha-Un more frequently. He would lean his head toward her, sniffing the air near her face and her neck, assessing her condition. The Velkari apparently had the ability to sense sickness in other creatures. They knew that Ha-Un's body was struggling, and they knew that she needed their help even more than she had needed it before. Daewon never left his post at the entrance, but he was watching, always aware of what was happening inside the cave. At one point, when Ha-Un's fever spiked and she began to mutter incoherently, Daewon made a sound that cut through even the noise of the wind. It was a call, a kind of command, and both Mira and Tayo responded immediately. Mira moved even closer, pressing her entire side against Ha-Yun. Tayo adjusted his position so that his head was near Ha-Yun's head, so that his breath would touch her face and help her maintain breathing if her fever caused her to struggle for air. Ha-Yun found herself gripping Mira's scales like they were a lifeline. The cold stone of the cave had faded away. The only thing that was real was the warmth of the two creatures surrounding her and the awareness that Daewon was still there at the entrance, still vigilant, still keeping watch, still ensuring that she would survive this night. The fever eventually broke around what Ha-un thought was dawn, though with no light to tell her for certain. She opened her eyes and found herself looking directly into Mira's large, intelligent eyes. The smaller Velkari was watching her carefully, and when she realized Ha-un was awake and aware, she made a soft sound that seemed almost like relief. Ha-un tried to sit up, but her muscles were weak and shaking. Mira helped, adjusting her position to support the human. Teo remained close, but he gave her a little more room to move. And Daewon, at the cave entrance, finally moved away from his position. The wind outside had diminished significantly. The storm was passing. The night was ending. Ha-un looked at the three creatures that had saved her life and understood something fundamental about the universe. Compassion existed in many forms, in many species, in many different kinds of bodies. Strength was not about power or size or who could hunt better. Strength was about choosing to protect someone weaker than yourself. Strength was about standing watch through the entire night to ensure that another creature survived. Strength was about bonds that transcended species and species boundaries. The toxic winds were fading. The dawn was coming. And for the first time since she had forgotten her lunch that morning, Ha-un felt truly safe. The rescue team arrived just as the sun was breaking over the crystalline forest, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. The vehicles moved quickly through the landscape, their sensors picking up Ha-un's emergency signal that she had activated once the winds had passed and it became safe to do so. Director Kim Sung-jae was leading the team personally, his face tight with worry and concern. The first indication that something unusual had happened came when the team rounded a formation of crystal trees and saw three large Velkari standing in the open area near the monitoring station. The team's weapon systems activated automatically, a defensive response that had been programmed into every vehicle on Kepler 442b. The protocol was clear. Unknown Velkari outside the designated contact zones were to be considered potential threats. But Ha-un's voice came through the communication system before anyone could act. Her voice was weak, tired, and feverish, but it was absolutely clear and authoritative. "Stand down. All weapons down. Now," she said. There was no room for argument in her tone. "These creatures are not threats. Do not engage. Do not approach with weapons." The rescue team hesitated. It was irregular for the lead scientist to be giving direct orders to the security team. But Ha-un's position as the lead xenobiologist carried weight. She was the expert on Velkari behavior. If she said they were not threats, then they were not threats. Director Kim ordered the weapons systems to stand down, though he kept them ready for immediate activation. The vehicles slowed their approach, moving more cautiously. As they got closer, the team could see Ha-un emerging from a cave entrance in the crystalline forest. She was walking slowly, supported by Mira, the smallest of the three Velkari. Tayo was walking beside her, and Daewon was bringing up the rear, moving with a kind of protective posture that made it clear he was guarding the human. The rescue team pulled up slowly, and the side door of the lead vehicle opened. Medics emerged, their equipment ready to assess and treat whatever injuries or illnesses Ha-un might have sustained. But as they approached, Daewon made a low sound, a warning that was immediately understood. "Do not come too close too quickly. Respect the space. Respect the bond that had been formed." Ha-un held up her hand in a gesture meant to slow the medics down. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice made it clear that she was anything but all right. She was feverish, exhausted, and running on nothing but adrenaline and determination. "I need medical attention, yes, but nothing is critical." Director Kim stepped out of the vehicle and approached Ha-un carefully. His face showed both relief that she was alive and complete confusion about what had happened. "Dr. Ha-Yun, what happened? Why were you in a cave? Why are the Velkari with you?" His questions came rapidly, overlapping each other, showing just how confused and concerned he was. Ha-Yun tried to explain, but her voice kept fading in and out. The fever was making her thoughts unclear. The medics gently took her from Mira's side and began to examine her, checking her vital signs and assessing her condition. They found that she had a significant fever, signs of dehydration, and stress-related exhaustion, but nothing that would not respond to proper medical treatment. "She needs rest and rehydration," one of the medics said, "but she's stable." As they were preparing to move Ha-Un into the vehicle for transport back to the main settlement, something remarkable happened. The three Velkari moved to follow. Daewon placed himself directly in the path between Ha-Un and the vehicle, his large body blocking the way. His message was clear and unmistakable. The human was not going anywhere without them. "They won't let her leave," one of the security officers said nervously, hand moving toward the weapon system. "No," Director Kim said, understanding in that moment what Ha-Un had been trying to say. "They're not trying to harm her. They're protecting her. Stand down." Ha-Un looked at Daewon, and despite her exhaustion and fever, she managed a small smile. "They saved my life," she said quietly. "All three of them. They brought me food when I was stranded. They kept me warm through the night when I had a fever. They kept watch. They kept me safe. I can't just leave them." The director considered this carefully. The protocols for human and Velkari interaction had never covered a situation like this. There was no procedure for what to do when an alien species became protective of a human. But Director Kim was a practical man, and he could see the genuine connection between Ha-Un and the three creatures. "Can they travel in the vehicle?" he asked. "I don't know," Ha-Un admitted. "But I don't want to leave them. I don't want to break the bond that's formed. If they come, I can explain what happened. I can help make sure they're not seen as a threat." The medics were not happy about the idea of transporting three large alien creatures in their rescue vehicle, but they were willing to accommodate the request if it meant getting Ha-Yun to proper medical treatment. Slowly, carefully, with weapons still ready and all protocols ready to activate at the first sign of aggression, the Velkari cubs were allowed to board the vehicle. Daewon positioned himself protectively near Ha-Un's side. Mira settled near her head, keeping watch. Teo was more nervous in the enclosed space, but he remained calm, trusting in Daewon's judgment that this was safe. As the vehicle began to move back toward the main settlement, Ha-Un found herself looking at the three creatures that had saved her life. The entire scientific understanding of the Velkari was about to change. The careful protocols and defensive procedures would need to be rewritten. The colonists' understanding of the creatures as animals, or at best as intelligent animals, would need to expand to include the reality of what they were. The creatures on Kepler 442b were not just intelligent. They were capable of compassion. They were capable of forming bonds across species. They were capable of choosing to care for others even when it put them at risk. And that change in understanding, Haman realized, would transform everything about how humans and Velkari would relate to each other going forward.